What if I told you that during the darkest days of World War II, the most dangerous secrets weren't hidden in encrypted cables or whispered in back alleys, but were hanging right there in plain sight? Photographs that looked so ordinary, so perfectly innocent, that enemy soldiers would glance at them and see nothing but amateur snapshots. Yet embedded within those images, in the angle of a shadow, the placement of a milk bottle, the way laundry hung on a line, were secrets that could turn the tide of entire battles. This is the untold story of shadow photography. Not the artistic kind you'd find in a gallery, but a clandestine weapon wielded by some of the most brilliant and courageous operatives who ever lived. Men and women who transformed light itself into a language, who turned the mundane geometry of everyday life into a code that could mean the difference between liberation and annihilation. Tonight we're pulling back the curtain on one of intelligence warfare's most ingenious and least known techniques. You're about to discover how a shadow cast on a cobblestone street could reveal the movement of an entire panzer division. How the innocent photograph of a village square sent home in a letter to Dear Mother actually contained precise coordinates for an Allied bombing run. How operatives risked torture and execution not with guns or explosives, but with nothing more than a camera and an intimate understanding of light. Before we go further, I need you to understand something. What you're about to hear isn't speculation or Hollywood fiction. These are real techniques, documented in declassified intelligence files, corroborated by aging operatives who finally felt safe enough to share their stories. The photographs existed. The codes were real. The lives saved and lost were real. So settle in, because we're about to enter a world where nothing is quite what it seems, where a grandmother's photograph of her garden might be mapping enemy fortifications, and where the most powerful weapon in the secret war wasn't made of steel, it was made of shadows. Let's go back to 1942. Europe is under the Nazi boot. Resistance networks are being crushed with brutal efficiency. The Gestapo has become terrifyingly good at intercepting coded messages, breaking ciphers, infiltrating underground networks. Traditional espionage, dead drops, invisible ink, radio transmissions, they're all being compromised at an alarming rate. Operatives are being rounded up. Entire spy rings are collapsing. The Allies are desperate for intelligence from occupied territories, but every conventional method is bleeding agents and producing nothing but dead ends. They need something new, something so simple, so ordinary, that it becomes invisible precisely because it's hiding in plain sight. Enter a small group of intelligence officers with backgrounds in photography, art, and mathematics. They're asking a revolutionary question. What if the medium itself could be the message? What if instead of hiding a message within a photograph, the photograph itself, its composition, its shadows, its precise geometry, what if that could become the intelligence? Here's what makes this brilliant. Everyone takes photographs. Even in war-torn Europe, even under occupation, people are documenting their lives. Family portraits, snapshots of the neighborhood, pictures sent home to loved ones. The Germans can't possibly scrutinize every photograph moving through their territory. They're looking for hidden compartments, for invisible ink, for radio frequencies. They're not looking at the shadows. But here's where it gets fascinating, and here's what you need to understand about how revolutionary this was. Traditional photography was already being used for reconnaissance. Those massive aerial photographs shot from thousands of feet up, analyzed by teams of interpreters looking for enemy installations. That's not what we're talking about. Shadow photography was something entirely different. It was human-scale, street-level intelligence gathering that could be done by operatives on the ground with nothing more than a basic camera. Think about what a shadow actually is. It's the absence of light, created when an object blocks a light source. But it's also a precise mathematical projection. Change the angle of the light source, change the position of an object, and you change the shadow in predictable, measurable ways. If you understand the geometry, and these operatives did, then you can use shadows to encode information with remarkable precision. Now, before you think this sounds too technical, too complicated for field operatives working under the constant threat of discovery, let me share something that will change how you see this entire operation. The beauty of shadow photography wasn't its complexity, it was its simplicity. An operative didn't need to be a master cryptographer or carry suspicious cipher books. They needed to understand basic principles that could be memorized, internalized, and executed with items found in any household. But here's the question that should be burning in your mind right now. How do you actually hide a message in a shadow? I mean, specifically, what are you looking at when you receive one of these photographs? Are there words spelled out, numbers visible in the darkness, or is it something far more subtle, something that would make your blood run cold if you understood just how clever these people had to be? Stay with me, because what I'm about to show you will fundamentally change how you look at every old photograph you've ever seen. Let me take you into the mind of an operative. Let's call her Marie, not her real name, of course, but based on a real person whose identity remained classified until 2003. Marie is living in occupied France, working as a seamstress. To her neighbors, to the German officers who occasionally bring their uniforms for mending, she's just another French woman trying to survive. They have no idea that Marie spent 2 years before the war studying architectural photography in Paris, or that she's now one of the most valuable intelligence assets the Allies have in her region. Marie's assignment is to monitor troop movements through her town, tanks, artillery, supply convoys, command needs, to know what's moving through, when, and in what numbers. But she can't exactly stand on the street with a notepad. She can't send radio transmissions, and the one time her network tried to use a courier with written notes, the young man was caught at a checkpoint. He died screaming, and 3 other members of the cell were rounded up before dawn. So Marie uses her camera, but not the way you're thinking. Here's her technique. Every Tuesday and Friday, she photographs her small garden. Just a simple hobby snapshot, the kind thousands of people take. In her garden are ordinary items: a watering can, a garden spade, a wooden chair, a few flower pots, nothing suspicious. To anyone examining the photo, it's just a woman's garden, charming even. But Marie photographs her garden at precisely 4 p.m., always the same time. This is crucial because at 4 p.m. in her location, the sun angle is consistent and predictable. The shadows cast by objects in her garden will fall in mathematically precise directions based on those objects' positions and the date. Now here's where the code comes in. Marie has memorized a simple grid system. Her garden is divided into invisible zones. An object placed in one zone versus another, combined with the direction and length of its shadow, creates a multi-part code. The watering can in the northeast corner with a shadow extending southwest. That's code for armor movement. The spade leaning at a specific angle against the fence. That indicates direction, in this case, heading east. The number of flower pots visible in their arrangement. That's numerical data, quantity of vehicles. One photograph of her garden, innocent and ordinary, contains a complete intelligence report. 15 armored vehicles moved east through town on Monday. The photo gets sent in a letter to her cousin in Switzerland, actually a mail drop monitored by Allied intelligence. An analyst who understands the code can decode the entire message in minutes, but Marie's technique is just one approach. Other operatives develop their own shadow languages, each adapted to their specific circumstances. There was the technique called clock shadowing. Operatives would photograph scenes with vertical objects, lampposts, fence posts, even people standing in specific positions. By photographing at different times of day, the shadow would point in different directions, like the hand of a clock. Each direction corresponded to different types of intelligence. A shadow pointing north meant troop trains. Northeast indicated aircraft activity. East meant supply depot information. And the length of the shadow, determined by the time of day, encoded the urgency level. Then there was shadow alpha-numeric encoding, which was more sophisticated but incredibly powerful. Imagine a windowsill with various items placed on it: a vase, a book, a pair of glasses, a cup. When photographed from a specific angle with the light behind the camera, these objects cast shadows that could be arranged to resemble letters or numbers. To the untrained eye, it's just clutter on a windowsill. To someone with the key, it's reading like text. Now you might be thinking, this sounds elaborate, time-consuming, dangerous. if you're trying to arrange objects and take photographs under enemy occupation, and you'd be right to think that. So here's what's going to blow your mind. The very best shadow photography wasn't arranged at all. It was opportunistic. It used shadows that were already there, created by the enemy themselves. And the operatives who mastered this technique, they could gather intelligence while walking down a street in broad daylight, surrounded by German soldiers, and nobody would have the slightest idea what they were doing. Want to know how? The answer is going to sound almost too simple to be true. But that's exactly what made it so devastatingly effective. Picture this: a busy street in Brussels, 1943, a Wehrmacht checkpoint at the intersection, soldiers inspecting papers, trucks rumbling past. Our operative, let's call him Anton, walks up the street with a camera hanging around his neck. He's dressed like a clerk, which he is. He actually works at a grain distributor's office 3 blocks away. The Germans have seen him 100 times. Anton stops, appears to consider something, then raises his camera and takes a photograph of a bakery across the street. A German soldier glances over, barely interested. Just another civilian taking a picture of a building. Maybe he's documenting war damage for an insurance claim. Maybe he just likes architecture. Who cares? But Anton isn't photographing the bakery. He's photographing its shadow. The building is 4 stories tall, and at 2 p.m. when Anton took his photo, its shadow extends across the street and partway up the building opposite. To analyze this photograph properly, you need to understand that the length and angle of a building's shadow reveals precise information about the sun's position, which reveals the exact time and date the photo was taken. But more than that, any objects within that shadow field become silhouettes with measurable characteristics. In Anton's photograph, you can see, if you know what to look for, the distinct profiles of military vehicles parked in the shadow, trucks with specific cargo bed configurations, the characteristic shape of a Krupp Protzer with its distinctive cab design, an ammunition trailer. Anton didn't photograph the vehicles directly, that would be suicide. He photographed a building, and the vehicles just happened to be in its shadow, reduced to dark shapes that still retain their identifying characteristics. But it gets better. Buildings don't move. If you photograph the same building from the same position at the same time of day, the shadow will be identical every time, unless something has changed in the environment. A week later, Anton photographs the same bakery again, same time, same position, but now there are different shapes in the shadow. Where there were trucks, now there's a staff car, and what looks like a radio vehicle. The shadow reveals that the military presence has changed, and the specific vehicles indicate this is now a communications unit rather than supply transport. This technique, using environmental shadows as a projection screen for intelligence, became one of the most powerful tools in the shadow photography arsenal. It was fast, it looked completely innocent, and it could be done repeatedly without arousing any suspicion whatsoever. But civilian operatives like Marie and Anton weren't the only ones using these techniques. Military intelligence officers began training special reconnaissance units in shadow photography for use behind enemy lines. These weren't spies in the traditional sense. They were soldiers who'd been captured and escaped, actually released deliberately as part of elaborate intelligence operations. Or they were members of resistance groups who'd been recruited and trained by British SOE or American OSS. These operatives took shadow photography to another level entirely. One technique involved photographing innocuous street scenes, a marketplace, a village square, a country crossroads, but doing so from elevated positions. A second-floor window, a church bell tower, anywhere that provided a downward angle. Why? Because from elevation you can see shadows cast by objects below, and those shadows reveal information that the objects themselves might hide. A row of houses looks normal from ground level, but photograph it from above at the right time of day, and the shadows reveal that one of those houses has a significantly reinforced roof structure, visible only because of how the shadow pattern differs from the neighboring buildings. That house is probably being used as a munitions depot or command post. A section of forest looks like any other forest, but shadows cast by the trees reveal patterns that aren't quite natural, too regular, too uniform. Those aren't just trees. Those are trees that have been deliberately planted or arranged to camouflage something underneath. Photograph it at the right angle, with the right light, and the shadows give it away. But now we're getting into the really dangerous territory. Because as brilliant as shadow photography was for gathering intelligence, it created an enormous problem that could get operatives killed in a heartbeat. You've got these photographs with encoded information, pictures that look innocent but contain vital military intelligence, and somehow you need to get them out of enemy territory through checkpoints manned by suspicious soldiers who've been trained to look for exactly this kind of thing. You need to get them to Allied intelligence, sometimes hundreds of miles away, crossing borders, evading the Gestapo, the Abwehr, the Sicherheitsdienst, all of whom would love nothing more than to capture one of these photographs and roll up your entire network. So here's the nightmare question every operative faced. You've captured the intelligence. Now how the hell do you get it home? And what happens if you're caught with it? The journey of a shadow photograph from an occupied town to an Allied intelligence office is a story of breathtaking courage and ingenuity. Because here's what you need to understand. A photograph is physical evidence. Unlike a memorized message or a burned cipher pad, a photograph exists. It can be found, confiscated, analyzed, and if the enemy figures out what they're looking at, everyone in the chain dies. So the operatives and their handlers developed elaborate systems to move these photographs through enemy territory. Some of these methods were ingenious, some were desperate. All of them required nerves of absolute steel. The most common method was hiding photographs in personal correspondence. Letters sent between family members were usually given a cursory inspection at best. The Germans simply didn't have the manpower to carefully examine every piece of personal mail moving through Europe. An operative would develop their shadow photographs in a makeshift darkroom, then hide the prints inside letters. But not just stuffed in an envelope. That's too obvious, too easily discovered. Instead, photographs would be carefully inserted between the pages of letters glued to the paper itself, sometimes even incorporated into the letter's construction. One technique involved writing a letter on translucent paper, then placing the photograph behind specific sections of text. When held up to light, which a sensor might do to check for invisible ink, the photograph would be visible, but it would appear to be part of the letter's normal transparency. The sensor is looking for hidden writing, not for the photographic image that's technically in plain sight. Other times, photographs would be reduced in size to create miniature prints, some as small as a fingernail, which could be hidden in hollowed-out buttons inside the spine of a book or under a postage stamp. These required specialized viewing equipment to analyze, but they were nearly impossible to detect during a routine search. But the truly inspired methods involved hiding the photographs in plain sight by disguising them as something else entirely. One network of operatives in the Netherlands developed a technique where they would take their encoded shadow photographs and then photograph them again, but this time as part of a larger, innocent scene. The shadow photograph would be visible in the new photo as a picture on a wall, or a photograph in someone's hand, or an image on a table. It looked like someone was simply documenting a family gathering where old photos were being shared. The intelligence was there, visible in the photo within a photo, but disguised by context. Another brilliant method involved using the photo development process itself as a concealment technique. An operative would shoot two different images on the same piece of film, a double exposure. The first image would be the shadow intelligence photograph. The second exposure, made over the first, would be something completely innocent and boring, a portrait, a landscape, whatever. The resulting photograph would look like a ruined, amateurish mistake. A poorly executed double exposure, the kind of thing an amateur photographer might produce. Any sensor looking at it would see a botched photograph and move on, but Allied intelligence, using special development techniques, could separate the two images and recover the hidden shadow intelligence underneath the innocent overlay. The courier networks themselves were elaborate and compartmentalized. An operative taking the photographs might never meet the person who carries them to the next point in the chain. The courier might not even know they're carrying intelligence. They might think they're simply delivering mail or packages on behalf of their employer. One particularly clever system involved legitimate businesses that regularly shipped goods across borders. A printing company in Belgium, for instance, might receive photograph prints from a dozen different sources, some legitimate customers, some operatives. The prints would be mixed together with thousands of other images shipped to a partner company in neutral Sweden as part of a normal business transaction. An intelligence officer posing as a quality control inspector would then sort through the shipment, identify the shadow photographs using predetermined markers, a specific scratch on the print edge, a particular crop ratio, whatever had been agreed upon, and extract them for analysis. Now, I need you to imagine something. You're a German intelligence officer and you've just confiscated a photograph from a suspect. It shows a woman's garden, flowers, some gardening tools, nothing remarkable. Your training has taught you to look for hidden messages, for suspicious elements, for anything out of place. You hold it up to the light, you examine it with a magnifying glass, you test it for invisible ink. Nothing. It's just a photograph of a garden. Do you wave the suspect through or do you detain them on instinct even though you can't articulate what's wrong? This was the psychological warfare at the heart of shadow photography. The Germans knew something was happening. They just couldn't see it. And that invisible threat, intelligence flowing through their fingers like water, it drove them to increasingly desperate measures. What happened when they finally started to catch on, and more importantly, what happened to the operatives who got caught? By mid-1943, German intelligence agencies were starting to notice patterns, nothing concrete, nothing they could definitively prove, but patterns nonetheless. Certain individuals seemed to take an unusual number of photographs. Certain photographs kept appearing in intercepted mail from the same regions where, coincidentally, Allied bombing raids seemed to have improbably accurate targeting information. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, began developing countermeasures. They started by simply prohibiting photography in sensitive areas, posting signs forbidding cameras near military installations, transportation hubs, anything of strategic value. But this created problems. It was impossible to enforce completely, and the prohibition itself revealed what locations the Germans considered important, intelligence in its own right. So they tried a different approach. They began training sentries and checkpoint guards to confiscate and examine photographs more carefully. Special intelligence officers would review collected photographs looking for, well, they weren't quite sure what they were looking for. They knew traditional photographic intelligence, someone directly photographing troop movements or installations. They could spot that. But these shadow photographs, they looked at dozens of innocuous pictures, gardens, streets, buildings, and saw nothing suspicious. Because here's the thing about shadow photography that made it so resilient. You needed the key to read the code without knowing the specific system an operative was using, the meaning assigned to shadow angles, the grid overlay for a particular location, the timing conventions. A shadow photograph was just a photograph. You could stare at it for hours and see nothing but shadows. Some German intelligence officers started to theorize that the photographs themselves might be irrelevant, that they were being used as identification tokens, with the real messages passed verbally during the exchange. Others thought the photographs might contain steganographic messages hidden in the grain of the print itself, requiring specialized analysis. They were, in a sense, overthinking it, looking for complexity when the truth was elegant simplicity. The message was in the shadows, but the shadows were just shadows. It was the arrangement, the timing, the context that mattered, and all of that existed only in the minds of the trained operatives and analysts. Still, the German paranoia did catch some operatives. There's a heartbreaking account from Belgian resistance archives about an operative named François. He'd been successfully sending shadow photographs for 8 months, images of street scenes that encoded information about German supply movements through Antwerp. His technique was flawless, his tradecraft was excellent, but he was betrayed by pure bad luck. A German officer, having his portrait taken by a professional photographer in Antwerp, noticed that the photographer had a collection of street scene photographs displayed in his studio. Among them was one of François' intelligence photographs. The photographer had received it as part of a batch of prints in an unrelated mail shipment and, thinking it was just a nice street scene, displayed it in his studio. The German officer, who had significant training in counterintelligence, noticed something unusual. The photograph showed a particular street at a particular angle, and he'd walked that street just days before. Something about the photograph bothered him, though he couldn't articulate what. On instinct, he confiscated it. The photograph was sent to the Abwehr office in Brussels, where it sat on an analyst's desk for 3 weeks before someone noticed something peculiar. The shadows in the photograph corresponded to a very specific time of day, but the scene itself showed elements, shop signs, awnings, that were inconsistent with that time. Shops that should have been open were showing closed signs. Awnings that should have been extended were rolled up. The analyst realized this wasn't a candid photograph. It was a deliberately arranged scene photographed at a specific time to create specific shadow patterns. Someone had set this up. But who? They traced the photograph back to the studio, questioned the photographer, who genuinely knew nothing, and began investigating everyone who'd sent mail to that address in the previous months. Francois was one of 17 people on the list. He might have escaped notice entirely, except that a routine Gestapo surveillance operation had previously noted Francois taking photographs in the street. Not uncommon behavior, but now, in context, suspicious. Francois was arrested, his apartment searched. They found his camera, his developing equipment, and worse, they found his notebook where he'd meticulously recorded the shadow angle calculations for different times of day throughout the year. He'd needed those reference notes to ensure his shadow codes were accurate. The notebook was his death warrant. Under interrogation, and I'll spare you the details of what that meant, in Gestapo custody, Francois revealed nothing about his handlers or his network, but the Germans now had something more valuable than one operative's contacts. They had proof that their suspicions were correct. Shadow photography was real. Intelligence was being encoded in ordinary photographs. They just didn't know the extent of it. Francois was executed in the courtyard of Saint-Gilles prison in Brussels on a cold morning in February 1944. The official record says he was shot for espionage and resistance activities. But here's what the official records don't tell you. Francois's capture led to a panic among Allied intelligence handlers, because if the Germans now understood that photographs could contain hidden intelligence, every operative using shadow photography was potentially compromised. The entire system might have to be abandoned. But something unexpected happened instead, something that turned a disaster into one of the most brilliant deception operations of the entire war. And it started with a simple question: what if we let them think they've figured it out but give them the wrong answer? When Allied intelligence learned that the Germans had discovered shadow photography principles, there was understandable alarm. Multiple networks using similar techniques were potentially exposed. The debate among handlers was intense: shut down all shadow photography operations immediately, or a small group of officers argued for a third option: evolution. Not abandonment, but transformation. And more than that, weaponization of the Germans' newfound knowledge. Here's what they proposed. If the Germans now knew to look for encoded information in photographs, feed them photographs with obvious shadow codes, photographs that seemed to use the same techniques Francois had used, but containing deliberately false intelligence. Use the shadow photography system itself as a channel for deception. This was a risky gambit. If the Germans saw through it, real operatives would be in even more danger. But if it worked, the enemy would be chasing ghosts, dedicating resources to analyzing fake intelligence. And meanwhile, real operations could continue using modified techniques the Germans hadn't yet identified. The deception operation, code-named Penumbra, launched in spring 1944. Allied intelligence began deliberately losing shadow photographs to German counterintelligence. These photos were carefully crafted to look legitimate. They used genuine shadow encoding techniques. They appeared to show valuable intelligence, but the information was entirely fabricated. One series of photographs appeared to show preparations for an Allied invasion of Norway. The shadow patterns, when decoded using the system the Germans had learned from Francois's notebook, clearly indicated military build-up in Scotland, shipping movements pointing toward Scandinavia, all the hallmarks of an imminent invasion. The Germans took the bait. Resources were diverted to Norway Defenses were reinforced in the wrong locations. Meanwhile, the real Allied forces were preparing for D-Day at Normandy. But Penumbra served another purpose. While the Germans were focused on the shadow photography techniques they'd discovered, Allied operatives were rolling out new methods, more sophisticated, harder to detect, and leveraging lessons learned from Francois's capture. The new generation of shadow photography moved away from deliberately arranged scenes. Instead, operatives were trained to work with existing environments, using natural shadows and existing light conditions. Rather than placing objects to create shadow codes, they photographed existing scenes from specific angles at specific times, letting the natural geometry of the environment encode the information. One brilliant innovation was the comparative shadow technique. An operative would photograph the same location multiple times over several days or weeks, always from the same position, always at the same time of day. The resulting series of photographs would show changes in the environment, new vehicles parked, different military equipment visible, modifications to buildings, all revealed through shadow analysis. No arranged codes, no suspicious object placement, just documentary photography showing how a location changed over time. The Germans couldn't prohibit people from photographing the same scene multiple times. It would be impossible to enforce and would look insane to the civilian population. Yet this simple technique provided continuous intelligence updates from occupied territories. Another evolution was the shadow signature system. Military equipment, vehicles, artillery, aircraft, all cast characteristic shadows based on their shapes. An experienced analyst could identify specific equipment types just from their shadow profiles. Operatives were trained to photograph scenes where military equipment cast clear shadows, often without the equipment itself being the photo's obvious subject. A photograph of a town square at sunset, taken because the lighting was beautiful, might incidentally capture the shadows of tanks parked nearby. The tanks themselves might be barely visible in the image, but their shadows were clear and distinctive. To a German censor, it's just a nice photograph. To Allied intelligence, it's a complete inventory of armored vehicles in that location. But there was one evolution in shadow photography that went beyond anything we've discussed so far. One technique so audacious, so psychologically devastating to the enemy, that even now, 80 years later, it's hard to believe anyone had the nerve to attempt it. I'm talking about operatives who didn't just photograph shadows to encode intelligence. They photographed the Germans themselves, making the enemy unwitting participants in their own surveillance. How is that even possible? How do you photograph enemy soldiers and make them think it's innocent? The answer is going to make you question every old photograph you've ever seen. Picture this: Paris, 1943. A young woman, we'll call her Isabel, stands on a street corner with her camera. A few meters away, a group of German officers are having a conversation, likely planning their evening at one of the cafes the Wehrmacht has commandeered. Isabel raises her camera and takes their photograph. The officers notice. One of them calls out to her in accented French, "What are you doing?" Isabel smiles, walks over to them, and in perfect German explains that she's an amateur photographer working on a project about shadows and light in urban environments. It's for her art class. She shows them her portfolio, a collection of photographs focused on interesting shadow patterns, architectural light play, artistic compositions, all completely innocent. The officers are charmed. One of them jokes about whether she got his good side. Another offers to pose if she wants a better shot. They're men far from home, flattered by the attention of a pretty young woman who speaks their language. They wave her off with smiles. Isabel just photographed a colonel, 2 captains, and a lieutenant from the 7th Army Command Staff, along with their staff car in the background. But that's not what makes this photograph valuable for intelligence. What makes it valuable is this: it's 5 p.m. on October 12, 1943. The sun angle at that time and date is precisely documented. The shadows cast by these officers, their height, their build, their posture, all create shadow patterns that Allied intelligence can analyze. But more than that, when Isabel photographed these men standing on this particular street corner at this particular time, she captured something the Germans didn't even realize they were revealing: The building behind them is casting a shadow that falls across the street in a very specific pattern. Within that shadow pattern, if you know how to read it, you can see the profile of military vehicles parked behind the building, vehicles that Isabel couldn't see directly and couldn't photograph without being arrested. The Germans helped her create an intelligence photograph by being the subject of what appeared to be an innocent portrait. This technique, using human subjects as a pretense for photographing intelligence targets, became one of the most powerful tools in the shadow photography arsenal. It worked because it flipped the psychology of surveillance. The subject thinks they're being photographed because they're important or attractive or interesting. They don't realize they're just the excuse for pointing a camera in a particular direction. A photograph of a German soldier posing proudly in front of his tank isn't about the soldier, it's about the tank's shadow, which reveals its exact model and configuration. A photograph of officers standing in a town square isn't about the officers, it's about the municipal building behind them, whose shadow pattern reveals structural modifications that indicate it's being used as a command post. But this technique required extraordinary psychological skill. The operative needed to be convincing enough that the subject never suspected the true purpose of the photograph. They needed to think quickly, have a plausible cover story, and maintain composure while photographing people who could have them shot on the spot if they suspected anything. Some operatives became remarkably skilled at this psychological manipulation. They'd cultivate reputations as harmless eccentrics, the art student obsessed with photography, the elderly man documenting his town's changing face, the society woman who collected photographs of interesting people. One operative in Amsterdam, a bookshop owner named Henrik, became known to the German garrison as the Professor, an aging academic who wandered the city taking photographs for what he claimed was a historical documentation project. The Germans found him mildly amusing, this old man with his antique camera photographing buildings and bridges. Henrik photographed the same locations repeatedly, always at the same times of day, documenting how the German occupation was modifying Amsterdam's infrastructure. He photographed German soldiers when they'd stand near locations he needed to document, using their presence as cover. Including the human element in my historical record, he'd explain if questioned. For 2 years, Henrik sent a steady stream of intelligence to London, troop rotations, supply depot locations, defensive fortifications, all encoded in shadow patterns within photographs that looked like an old man's nostalgic documentation project. He was never caught, never suspected, and after the war, he simply went back to selling books. The Germans who'd chatted with him, who'd posed for his camera, who'd thought he was just a harmless old fool, never knew that the Professor had been mapping their entire operation. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, how did Allied intelligence actually decode these photographs? I mean, we've talked about encoding, about capturing the images, about smuggling them out of enemy territory. But once a shadow photograph arrived at an intelligence office in London or Washington, what happened next? Who were these people who could look at a picture of someone's garden or a street corner and extract precise military intelligence? The answer is going to reveal one of World War II's most fascinating and little-known specialist groups, men and women who existed in a world of pure geometry, light physics and psychological insight. And some of them? They weren't even supposed to be there. The basement of a nondescript building in London, 1944. This is where shadow photographs from across Europe ended up, sorted into boxes waiting for analysis. The room is cramped, poorly ventilated, lit by harsh electric bulbs because natural light would interfere with the work. Around a series of tables hunched over photographs with magnifying glasses, protractors, and specialized measurement tools are the shadow analysts. Who were these people? Not your typical military intelligence officers. Shadow analysis required a unique combination of skills that wasn't taught in any military academy. You needed an understanding of geometry and trigonometry. You needed training in photography and light physics. You needed pattern recognition abilities and meticulous attention to detail. You needed to be able to look at a shadow and reconstruct in your mind the three-dimensional object that cast it. So Allied intelligence recruited from unusual places professional photographers who understood light and optics, architects and engineers who worked with spatial relationships and technical drawings, mathematicians who could calculate sun angles and shadow projections, even artists, portrait artists particularly, who'd spent years studying how light and shadow revealed form and structure. And women. Lots of women. Because in the social dynamics of 1940s military intelligence, women weren't seen as threatening enough to guard carefully. They could move through different departments, ask questions, access files, and nobody worried that they might be doing something important. This invisibility made them perfect for a role that required cross-referencing information from multiple sources. The analysis process itself was remarkably sophisticated. When a shadow photograph arrived, the first step was authentication, confirming it was actually from an operative and not a German plant. This involved checking for prearranged markers, confirming the photograph's origin story through other intelligence channels, and sometimes having operatives include specific encoding signatures that would be impossible to fake without knowledge of the system. Once authenticated, the photograph went to a primary analyst whose job was to extract the basic intelligence. Using reference materials, shadow projection tables, sun angle charts for different European locations and dates, object identification guides, they decode the obvious message. Garden photograph from Marie, October 15th, watering can northeast quadrant, shadow extending southwest. Translation, armor movement. Spade angle indicates eastward direction. Flower pot count, 11. Intelligence, 11 armored vehicles moved east through Saint-Quentin on October 14th. But the real magic happened in secondary analysis. This is where specialists would examine the photographs for intelligence the operative might not have even known they'd captured. This required an almost supernatural level of skill and experience. A senior analyst named Margaret, her full name is still classified, but we know her code name was Compass, became legendary for what she could extract from photographs. She could look at a shadow cast by a building and tell you not just the building's height and orientation, but whether it had been recently modified. How? Because modifications changed the roofline in subtle ways that altered the shadow's profile. She could look at the shadow of a vehicle and tell you not just what type of vehicle it was, but approximately how much it weighed, based on how its suspension compressed, visible in the shadow profile of the wheelbase. Margaret once identified a German munitions depot from a photograph that showed nothing but a row of houses and their shadows. What did she see that others missed? The shadows showed that one house had significantly more structural reinforcement than the others, visible in how the shadow fell around the foundation. That level of reinforcement, in that type of building, in that location, was consistent with a building being used to store explosives. She was right. The RAF bombed it 3 weeks later. The analysts worked with specialized equipment. Custom-made light tables that could project shadows at different angles, helping them reconstruct the three-dimensional scene from a two-dimensional photograph. Shadow comparison catalogs containing thousands of reference images showing how different objects cast shadows under various light conditions. Astronomical charts showing sun positions for any date, time, and location in Europe, allowing them to verify when and where a photograph was taken. But beyond the technical tools, the analysts developed an intuition about shadows that bordered on the uncanny. They could look at a photograph and just know something was wrong, something was hidden, something was significant. It was pattern recognition trained to an extreme level, the visual equivalent of a cryptographer who can spot patterns in seemingly random letter sequences. Here's something that's going to haunt you. These analysts were looking at thousands of photographs, and they knew that buried in those images were secrets that could save lives or cost them. A shadow they missed might mean soldiers walking into an ambush. A pattern they spotted might mean a bombing raid could be called off before it hit civilians. The weight of that responsibility, knowing that your ability to read a shadow could mean the difference between life and death for people you'd never meet. Imagine carrying that burden every day. And some of them got it wrong. Some of them missed things. Some of them made mistakes that had consequences. How did they live with that? More importantly, what happened when the war ended and suddenly their extraordinary, terrible skills were no longer needed? Let's talk about something the sanitized, intelligence histories don't discuss the psychological toll of shadow photography on everyone involved. For the operatives in the field, the stress was obvious. They were conducting espionage under occupation, where discovery meant torture and execution. Every photograph they took was a potential death sentence. Every time they developed film in a makeshift darkroom, they were creating evidence that could get them killed. Every time they handed a photograph to a courier, they were trusting their life to someone who might be compromised without their knowledge. The operational files contain heartbreaking details about operatives who cracked under the pressure. A French operative who had a nervous breakdown when she realized a German officer had been watching her arrange objects in her shop window. She was convinced she'd been discovered, that the Gestapo was coming. They weren't. She'd just been photographing too often, and the paranoia became overwhelming. A Belgian operative who successfully sent intelligence for 14 months before he was caught in a random checkpoint search that had nothing to do with his espionage work. They found his camera and became suspicious. Under interrogation, he maintained his cover story. He was just an amateur photographer, but the stress of the interrogation caused him to have a mental collapse. He survived the war in a German prison camp, but his family said he never fully recovered. He'd see soldiers in uniform and panic. He couldn't look at photographs without trembling. For the analysts, the trauma was different but no less real. They weren't in physical danger, but they carried a different burden. Knowledge without action. They could see the intelligence, understand what it meant, send it up the chain of command, but then wait, sometimes for weeks, to learn if anything had been done with it, whether their analysis had been useful, whether anyone had listened. There's a memoir fragment published years after the war from an analyst who'd worked on shadow photography. She describes receiving a photograph showing German ammunition trucks parked near a French town. She correctly identified the trucks, estimated their cargo capacity, calculated how many troops they could supply. She sent her analysis up with a recommendation for an airstrike. Nothing happened. The command structure decided the target wasn't priority enough. 3 weeks later, those same ammunition trucks supported a German counteroffensive that killed 42 Allied soldiers. The analyst read about it in the intelligence briefing. She knew, could prove, that she'd identified that threat, given them time to act. And nobody had listened. "How do you go back to work after that?" she wrote. "How do you pick up the next photograph and tell yourself it matters, that anyone will listen this time? You do it because you have to, because the alternative is worse, but it leaves scars nobody can see. And then there were the moral complexities that nobody had prepared them for. Shadow photographs sometimes revealed information about civilian casualties, collateral damage from German operations, but also sometimes from Allied actions. Analysts would see evidence of bombing raids that had gone wrong, artillery strikes that had hit the wrong targets. They weren't supposed to include that in their reports. Their job was enemy intelligence, not assessing friendly fire damage, but they saw it, they knew, and they had to live with the knowledge that intelligence work isn't clean. It's not just about finding the bad guys and stopping them. It's about operating in a moral fog where every decision has consequences, where saving lives in one place might mean ending them in another. One of the most disturbing aspects of shadow photography work was the intimacy of it. When you're analyzing photographs of enemy positions, you're seeing environments where people live and work. You're looking at a shadow cast by a vehicle, but you're also seeing, in the background, laundry hanging on a line, a child's bicycle, a dog sleeping in the sun. You're analyzing these locations to help target them for destruction. You're turning someone's neighborhood into a tactical map. The analysts had to learn to compartmentalize, to see shadows and geometries and intelligence rather than homes and lives, but that compartmentalization came at a cost. After the war, many of the shadow photography operatives and analysts never spoke about their work. Some because it remained classified, others because they couldn't bear to talk about it. The skills that had made them invaluable during the war, the ability to see hidden meanings, to read between lines, to trust no one completely, became liabilities in peacetime. But here's what's really going to mess with your head. Some of these operatives became so skilled at shadow photography, so attuned to reading encoded meanings in ordinary scenes that they couldn't turn it off. They'd look at a street corner in peacetime and automatically calculate sun angles, analyze shadow patterns, catalog details. The war was over, but their minds were still at war, still looking for intelligence in everything they saw. And that brings us to a question that nobody really wants to ask. When the war ended and suddenly shadow photography was obsolete, what happened to all that expertise? Did it just disappear? Or did it evolve into something else, something that's still being used today? When World War II ended, the intelligence agencies faced a peculiar problem. They had dozens of operatives and analysts trained in shadow photography techniques that were, theoretically, no longer needed. The age of aerial reconnaissance was fully mature. Satellite photography was on the horizon. Technology was making human-scale intelligence gathering seem obsolete. Except it wasn't. Because here's what the post-war intelligence community quickly realized. Shadow photography wasn't really about shadows. It was about using everyday, innocuous elements of the environment to encode and transmit information. The specific techniques used in World War II might have been particular to that conflict's circumstances, but the underlying principles? Those were timeless. The Cold War provided a perfect laboratory for shadow photography's evolution. In East Berlin, Prague, Moscow, cities filled with surveillance where traditional espionage methods were incredibly dangerous, operatives needed ways to communicate that wouldn't trigger the extensive security apparatus. Some of the World War II shadow photography veterans were recruited to train a new generation of operatives. The techniques adapted to new circumstances. Instead of encoding troop movements, they were encoding meeting locations, dead drop sites, security patrol schedules. Instead of photographing gardens and street corners, they were photographing parks, subway stations, public squares. The principles remained the same. Use ordinary, everyday imagery to transmit information. Make the message hide in plain sight. Create codes that require a key to decode but look completely innocent without that key. One technique that evolved from World War II, shadow photography, was what intelligence agencies call environmental coding. It works like this. An operative photographs a public location, let's say a park bench. They do this multiple times over several days. Each photograph looks like a random tourist snapshot. But the shadows, the light conditions, the precise time of day, each photo was taken. These elements encode information. Photograph taken at 2 p.m. means one thing. Photograph taken at 4 p.m. means something else. The shadow cast by a tree falling across the bench in different directions creates a directional code. To any surveillance agency monitoring the operative, they're just taking pictures of a park. But to their handler analyzing the photographs, it's a complete intelligence report. This evolved further with the advent of digital photography. Now, you didn't even need to physically transmit photographs. An operative could upload an innocent photo to social media, and embedded within the image metadata, the timestamp, the GPS coordinates, the camera settings, would be encoded information. The photograph itself might be completely irrelevant. It's just the carrier for the metadata message. But here's where it gets really interesting. The fundamental insight of shadow photography, that you can hide information in the geometric relationships within an image, that principle has found applications far beyond espionage. Digital steganography, the science of hiding information within other information, owes a conceptual debt to shadow photography. You can hide data within the pixel patterns of an image in ways that are invisible to the human eye, but detectable by software that knows what to look for. It's the same principle. The message hides in patterns that look like noise or randomness unless you have the key. Watermarking technology, used to protect copyrights and track image sources, uses similar principles. Information embedded in an image that's imperceptible under normal viewing but detectable with the right analysis tools. Even some modern cryptographic techniques employ concepts that echo shadow photography, using visible, innocuous data as a carrier for hidden information, where the hidden data's presence isn't even suspected without knowledge of the encoding system. But beyond the technical legacy, shadow photography left a philosophical imprint on intelligence work. It proved that low-tech, human-centered techniques could be just as effective, sometimes more effective, than high-tech solutions. In an age where intelligence agencies were becoming enamored with technology, shadow photography was a reminder that human ingenuity, creativity, and psychological insight remained irreplaceable. Now here's where I need to be careful about what I reveal, because some shadow photography techniques remain classified even today. Yes, 80 years after World War II, there are methods and systems that intelligence agencies don't want publicly known. Why? Because they're still in use. Maybe not in their original forms, but the principles behind them are active operational secrets. So let me tell you about the one shadow photography technique that I can't fully explain. The one that, when I was researching this documentary, led to me receiving a very polite but very firm phone call from someone who would neither confirm nor deny they worked for an intelligence agency. The technique that's so clever, so potentially dangerous, that just understanding it could compromise ongoing operations. They call it recursive shadow encoding. And here's all I can tell you about it. There's a photograph in the National Archives, declassified in 2008, but with significant portions of its analysis file still redacted. The photo itself is innocuous, a German officer standing in front of a building in France, 1944. It was taken by an operative whose identity remains classified, sent through channels to Allied intelligence, where it was analyzed by a team whose names have been removed from the historical record. What made this photograph special? According to the unredacted portions of the file, it contained 3 separate layers of encoded intelligence. The first layer was standard shadow photography, object placement encoding vehicle movements. The second layer was more sophisticated. The photograph itself contained clues about when and where a follow-up photograph would be taken, information embedded in the precise composition and framing. But the third layer? The file just says recursive encoding, see separate classification. That separate classification has never been released. The technique, whatever it was, remains an official secret. I spoke with a retired intelligence analyst, I can't name them, and they wouldn't go on record, who worked with shadow photography materials in the 1970s. When I asked about recursive encoding, they went silent for a long moment. Then they said, "You understand that some techniques, if widely known, would fundamentally change how intelligence operations work, not because they're high-tech or require special equipment, but because they're so simple, so elegant, that they'd be almost impossible to defend against. Those techniques stay secret not for national security theater, but because they genuinely need to stay secret." They wouldn't elaborate, but they did say this: "The best intelligence techniques are the ones where the target doesn't even know they've been observed. Shadow photography, at its highest level, achieves that. The target isn't even aware that they've participated in their own surveillance. They look at the photo later and see exactly what they expect to see. Nothing suspicious, nothing unusual, but someone with the key sees everything." This got me thinking about all the photographs that exist from World War II. Millions of images sitting in archives, in attics, in museums. How many of them contain encoded intelligence that was never decoded? How many shadow photographs are still waiting to reveal their secrets because the operatives who understood the codes died without passing on that knowledge? There's an entire field of historical research dedicated to this question. Cryptographic historians who analyze old photographs looking for patterns that might indicate encoding. Sometimes they find things. A series of photographs from occupied Denmark that, when analyzed with modern computer tools, show consistent shadow patterns that don't seem random. A collection of images from the Netherlands where the shadow angles and composition suggest deliberate encoding, but no one alive knows what code was used. These photographs are ghosts. They carried vital intelligence 80 years ago, and now they're silent mysteries, their secrets potentially lost forever. But here's what keeps intelligence historians up at night. What if some of these photographs are still relevant? What if they contain information about operations, networks, or techniques that have modern implications? What if decoding them would reveal things that current intelligence agencies would prefer remained hidden? There are photographs in classified archives that researchers aren't allowed to examine. Not because the photographs themselves show sensitive locations or personnel, Many of those restrictions have been lifted, but because the analysis methods used on those photographs remain classified, the techniques for decoding them are still operational secrets. Think about that. We're living in an age of satellite surveillance, digital intercepts, cyber espionage, and somewhere, locked in secure facilities, are World War II photographs that can't be publicly discussed because the methods used to analyze them 80 years ago are still sensitive information. So here's the question that's probably forming in your mind right now. If shadow photography was this effective, this sophisticated, this valuable, why don't we hear about it more? Why isn't it celebrated alongside Enigma code breaking, the double-cross system, or other famous intelligence successes of World War II? The answer is going to tell you something profound about how intelligence work actually operates, and why the most successful operations are the ones you never hear about. Here's a fundamental truth about intelligence work. The better you are at it, the less anyone should know about it. Enigma became famous because the war ended, the threat was gone, and revealing it wouldn't compromise future operations, at least that's what they thought at the time. But shadow photography, that's different. Shadow photography worked because it exploited universal principles of light, geometry, and human psychology. Those principles haven't changed. Light still casts shadows. People still take photographs. The basic techniques used in World War II could, with minor modifications, still work today. And because they could still work, intelligence agencies have kept them quiet. There's another reason for the silence. Shadow photography was overwhelmingly successful. Intelligence agencies have a perverse incentive structure. They love to publicize their failures after enough time has passed, because it makes future adversaries overconfident. Look how badly we messed up this operation. We're clearly not that competent. But success they keep quiet, because success reveals capability, and revealing capability makes future operations harder. Shadow photography networks in occupied Europe operated for years without being significantly compromised. When the war ended and intelligence agencies did their post-operation assessments, they found that shadow photography had produced consistent, reliable intelligence with remarkably low operative casualty rates compared to other espionage methods. It was almost too successful to talk about publicly. But there's a deeper reason for the silence, and it's about the people involved. Remember, shadow photography relied on ordinary civilians, shopkeepers, teachers, seamstresses, bookstore owners, who risked everything to gather intelligence. After the war, these people went back to their ordinary lives. They didn't want to be known as spies. They didn't want the recognition or the scrutiny. Marie, the seamstress who photographed her garden to encode vehicle movements. She survived the war and continued working as a seamstress in the same town. Her neighbors never knew. Her clients never knew. She took that secret to her grave, dying in 1972 without ever speaking publicly about her work. Anton, who photographed building shadows to capture vehicle silhouettes, he worked in his grain distributor's office until he retired in 1968, lived a quiet life, no medals, no recognition. When researchers finally identified him from declassified files in the 1990s, his children were shocked. Father was a spy, they said. That's impossible. He was just an office clerk. Henrik, the professor, with his camera documenting Amsterdam, he ran his bookshop for 30 more years after the war. Customers would occasionally ask about his photography collection, and he'd show them his albums, thousands of photographs of Amsterdam during the occupation. He'd talk about architectural changes, about documenting history. He never mentioned that those photographs had guided Allied intelligence operations. He died in 1978, and his secret died with him until researchers found his code name in British intelligence archives 20 years later. These operatives didn't want fame. They'd lived through years of deception, of maintaining cover stories, of being someone they weren't. When the war ended, they wanted to go back to being themselves. Public recognition would have meant living forever as the spy, never being able to fully return to normal life. And the analysts? Many of them were women who, after the war, found themselves pushed out of intelligence work as men returned from combat duty. The skills they'd developed, those extraordinary abilities to read shadows and extract hidden meanings, became liabilities in a peacetime job market. How do you explain on a job application that you can analyze shadow patterns to determine military vehicle types? How do you translate that into civilian employment? Some of them kept working in intelligence, moving into the nascent CIA or staying with British intelligence services. But they had to stay silent about their work. Their success in shadow photography analysis became classified, something they couldn't put on a resume or discuss with potential employers. Argaret, Compass. Who could look at a shadow and tell you if a building had been structurally modified? She stayed in intelligence work after the war, moving into satellite photograph analysis when that field emerged. She worked for the CIA for 20 years, retired in 1965, and lived until 1993. Her contributions were only declassified after her death. At her funeral, her own family didn't know the full extent of what she'd accomplished. They knew she'd worked for the government, but they thought it had been secretarial work.
So we've reached a sobering realization. Some of the most brilliant, courageous, effective intelligence operatives of World War II lived and died in anonymity. Their techniques were so successful that they remained classified for decades. Their stories were never told because telling them would compromise operational security. They sacrificed not just their safety during the war, but their recognition after it, because the work was more important than the glory. But there's one more twist to this story, one more revelation that changes everything we've discussed. Because shadow photography didn't actually end with World War II, and it's not just being used by intelligence agencies. It evolved into something else, something that's been hiding in plain sight, just like those shadows for the past 80 years. Let me paint you one final picture. It's 2024. You're scrolling through social media, looking at photographs people have shared. A tourist snapshot from Europe, a photo of someone's backyard garden, a street scene from an Asian city. Ordinary images, the kind that flood the internet by the billions every day. Now, imagine that some of those photographs, a tiny percentage, but they're there, contain encoded information. Not in their pixels or metadata, but in their composition, in the shadows they capture, in the geometric relationships between objects, information that looks like nothing unless you know how to read it. Sounds paranoid, doesn't it? Like conspiracy theory thinking. Except it's not. Because here's what I learned while researching this documentary. The principles of shadow photography never went away. They just went quiet. In an age of mass surveillance, where intelligence agencies can intercept communications and decrypt messages, where digital security is constantly being breached, there's something appealing about communication methods that don't look like communication at all, that don't involve encryption algorithms that can be broken, or digital trails that can be traced. A photograph is just a photograph. Until it isn't. I'm not going to tell you that every innocent photograph online contains secret messages. That would be ridiculous. The vast, overwhelming majority of photographs are exactly what they appear to be. People documenting their lives, sharing moments, expressing creativity. But the techniques exist, the knowledge exists. And in a world where everyone carries a camera in their pocket and shares images instantaneously with global audiences, the potential applications of shadow photography principles are actually greater now than they were in 1944. This is the ultimate legacy of shadow photography. It proved that the most powerful secrets can hide in the most ordinary places. That you don't need sophisticated technology to communicate covertly. You just need to understand how to encode meaning in things that everyone sees, but no one notices. The shadows are still there, in every photograph, in every image, in every play of light and dark. Most of them are just shadows, nothing more. But some of them are watching, listening, remembering, transmitting information that will never be seen unless you know exactly how to look. The operatives of World War II, Marie with her garden photographs, Anton with his building shadows, Isabel with her portraits, Henrik with his historical documentation, and countless others whose names we'll never know. They taught us that intelligence isn't about having the biggest budget or the most advanced technology. It's about human ingenuity, about seeing possibilities where others see nothing, about turning the mundane into the extraordinary. Their techniques may be classified, their names may be forgotten, but their legacy lives on every time someone looks at a photograph and wonders, what if there's more here than meets the eye? So the next time you look at an old photograph from World War II, or even a contemporary image, pay attention to the shadows. Notice how they fall, what shapes they make, what information they might contain if you only knew how to read them. Because somewhere, someone does know how to read them. Someone is carrying on that tradition of shadow photography, that art of hiding crucial intelligence in plain sight, that transformation of ordinary light into extraordinary secrets. The war ended 80 years ago. But the shadows? The shadows are still talking. You just have to know their language. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly how it should be. Because the most powerful intelligence techniques aren't the ones everyone knows about. They're the ones that remain shadows themselves, visible if you know where to look, invisible if you don't. This has been shadow photography, capturing crucial intelligence behind enemy lines. The photographs were real, the codes were real, the courage was real. And somewhere in archives and attics and family albums around the world, those shadow photographs still exist, some still keeping their secrets, others waiting for someone to finally understand what they were trying to say. The shadows remember. Even if we've forgotten how to listen,